I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I swear this really happened to me. It was on a cruise, a vacation I thought would be a dream come true. I don't even know where to start, but I guess it's better to start at the beginning. I had never been on a cruise before, so when I got the opportunity to go on a luxurious, all-inclusive ship, I jumped at the chance. The grand luxury of the ship was more than I could ever imagine. It had everything: gourmet food, an endless pool, casinos, bars, and even an art gallery. It was an absolute paradise, or at least it seemed that way. The first few days were wonderful. We docked at a few tropical islands, went on excursions, and spent the nights dancing in the club on board. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. The crew was friendly, the fellow passengers were kind, and the whole experience seemed like it could go on forever. But on the fourth night, things started to get off. I was having a drink at one of the lounges when I heard someone whisper my name. It was barely audible, like a soft breeze in the air. I glanced around, but no one was near me. I thought it was just the usual hum of the ship and the noise of people talking around me. But then it happened again, this time a bit louder and much clearer. Sarah. I spun around, looking at the faces of the people seated nearby. Nothing. I shrugged it off, figuring I was just imagining things. But as I went to walk back to my cabin, I heard it again. Only this time, it was accompanied by the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see a crew member or someone walking past me, but there was no one there. I started to feel uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I hurried back to my cabin, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread building in my chest. When I reached the door to my room, I fumbled with my keycard. I finally got the door open, but when I stepped inside, it felt cold, like the air conditioning was on full blast. But it wasn't just cold in temperature, it was like a deep, bone-chilling cold that hit me from the inside. The room was empty. My roommate had gone out to the casino, so I was alone. I thought I'd try to shake off the unease by taking a shower. Maybe the water would help calm me down. But the moment I turned on the faucet, something strange happened. The water coming out of the shower head was dark. Not just a little dark, but it looked almost black. I yanked the shower curtain back in a panic, thinking something had gone horribly wrong with the plumbing, but the water was completely clear. There was nothing to explain what I had just seen. My heart was racing. I stepped back, breathing heavily, still feeling the icy air that seemed to be surrounding me. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to leave the cabin. I was determined to get some fresh air and try to forget what had happened. I made my way to the upper deck, hoping the breeze and the sound of the ocean would help me clear my mind. But as I stood there, leaning over the railing, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see someone behind me, but once again, nothing. I looked out across the ocean, and the moonlight reflected off the waves, casting eerie shadows across the deck. It felt like I wasn't alone, but there was no one to be seen. I looked up, hoping to see other passengers, but the ship was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The whole deck was deserted. Then I heard it again, that whisper. Sarah. It came from behind me, but I couldn't turn fast enough. It felt like the sound was in my mind, echoing in my head. I froze. The voice was wrong. There was something unnatural about it. It wasn't human. It sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far below me, like it was coming from the ocean itself. My breath caught in my throat. That's when I saw her. I don't know how I didn't notice her earlier. She was standing by the lifeboats, staring at me. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her clothes, well, they didn't belong on a luxury cruise. She was wearing an old-fashioned white dress, like something out of the 1920s, and her long, wet hair hung limp around her shoulders. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, something that tugged at the back of my mind, but I couldn't quite place it. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the wind. I felt an icy chill creep down my spine. I knew I should turn and run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. She took a step forward, and I could see her eyes. They were wide, bloodshot, and hollow, as though she hadn't slept in days, or maybe even years. There was no life in them, just an empty void. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask her who she was, but nothing came out. The words were stuck in my throat. "Help me. Find peace," she repeated. Before I could react, she took another step, and I stumbled backward in panic, almost falling over the railing. She moved with an unnatural slowness, as if she were floating above the ground. She reached out for me with trembling hands, her fingers long and skeletal, her nails jagged. Then suddenly, she vanished. Like that, just gone. No footsteps, no sound, nothing. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it. I ran to the nearest crew member and told him what happened, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. "Ma'am, there's no one on this deck right now," he said. "Are you feeling all right?" I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. I even led him to the lifeboat area where I saw her, but there was no one there. No strange woman, no eerie feeling, just the usual quiet deck. I felt stupid, like maybe I had just overreacted or misinterpreted something. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The whispers hadn't stopped. Even as I walked down the corridors of the ship, I could hear them, soft but clear. "Sarah," they would call. "Help me." And every time I turned, there was nothing. No one. I asked a few of the other passengers if they had heard anything strange, but they all brushed it off. Some said the ship was haunted, but no one really believed it. It was just rumors, they said. But I wasn't so sure anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed in my cabin, feeling the presence of something unseen, something watching me. The lights flickered in and out, and I could hear the creaking of the ship as if it was alive, groaning under the weight of whatever was happening. Suddenly, I heard a knock at my door. I hesitated. I wasn't expecting anyone, and no one had knocked at this hour. I peeked through the peephole and saw nothing, just the empty hallway. But then the door rattled. I was paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the door. There was nothing there. No crew member, no one at all. But something was left behind. A small, wet footprint on the floor. It was clear water, but the strange thing was there was no water anywhere in the hallway. The ship was bone dry, and it was only in front of my door. I snapped. I had to leave. I grabbed my things and ran down to the lower deck, trying to find anyone who could help me. I heard the whispers again, louder this time. They were everywhere. And then I saw her again, the woman. She was standing in front of the lifeboat area again, her eyes locked on mine. "Help me," she whispered. "Help me find peace." But this time I didn't turn away. I walked toward her, determined to understand. I couldn't escape anymore, not from her or from the ship. When I reached her, I reached out, placing my hand on her cold, wet arm. Her eyes filled with something like relief. Then she spoke one final time. "Let me rest," she said. The next morning, the ship docked and they found nothing. No trace of me. I was gone. The crew said I must have disembarked without telling anyone, but I didn't. I'm still here and I've been trying to find peace. I hear her voice every night. The whispers, the cold, the footsteps, they never stop, and I know now, whatever it wasn't a ghost. It was a warning.
Next story.
It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. My friends and I had planned it for months, an all-inclusive cruise to the Caribbean. We imagined sunshine, cocktails by the pool, and lazy afternoons on pristine beaches. The reality, though, was far darker. From the moment I boarded the ship, something felt off. At first, I thought it was just nerves. I'd never been on a cruise before, and the massive size of the ship was a little overwhelming. The first few days were typical. We partied, ate way too much, and enjoyed the sunsets as they melted into the horizon. But that's when things started to take a strange turn. It began the night we were docked in a port, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, near the Bahamas. The weather was rough, and the crew had announced a delay in our departure, so we would be staying overnight. Most of us were a bit disappointed, but we figured we'd just enjoy the extra time to explore. That night, I decided to hit the deck for a late-night walk. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the sea. The ship seemed eerily quiet, much quieter than usual. I could feel the hum of the engines beneath my feet, but the usual sounds of people laughing, talking, and splashing around in the pools were absent. The breeze felt cold, even though it was warm outside, and the lights of the ship flickered like faulty bulbs. I walked past the casino and several empty lounges before I found myself at the bow of the ship. The sea stretched out before me, black and infinite. The wind was picking up, and the sound of the waves crashing against the ship was deafening. I was about to turn back when I saw her. She was standing by the railing, just staring out at the water, her back to me. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, the kind you might see in a historical movie. Her hair was long and black, flowing behind her as though it were underwater, despite the wind. I was taken aback. Who would be standing out here alone, especially in the middle of the night? "Excuse me," I called out, approaching her cautiously. She didn't respond. I tried again, a little louder this time, but still no reaction. That's when I noticed something strange. Her reflection in the water wasn't quite right. It didn't mirror her movements. She was perfectly still, but the reflection seemed to sway, as if caught in an invisible current. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to leave, but when I looked back, she was gone, vanished without a trace. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or someone in costume for a themed event. But that was just the beginning. The next night, the same thing happened, only this time, I wasn't alone. My friend Sarah and I decided to go out together after dinner, and as we were strolling along the deck, we heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind us. But when we turned around, no one was there. It wasn't until Sarah screamed that I realized something was wrong. She was pointing at the railing where we had seen the woman before, and there she was, standing again in the same old-fashioned white gown, staring into the abyss of the ocean. But this time, her face was visible, and it was wrong. Her features were too sharp, too pale. Her eyes were hollow, black holes that seemed to draw in the light. Her lips were stretched in a grotesque, twisted smile, and there was something wet about her face, as if she'd been crying for hours or perhaps even days. But there was no sound, no sobs, just that horrible, gaping grin. "Who the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I muttered, "but I'm getting out of here." As we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something else, a reflection in the water. This time, it wasn't just her. There were others, dozens of shadowy figures, all standing on the surface of the water, watching us. We bolted. We didn't stop running until we were back in our cabin, and we locked the door behind us. The next day, I tried to talk to the crew about it, but they just shrugged it off. "You must have seen someone in costume," they said. "We have a lot of themed events on board." But I knew it wasn't a costume. That woman, or whatever she was, had felt different. The atmosphere around the ship grew even more oppressive over the following days. It was like the air was thickening, pressing down on us. The crew became quieter, more distant. People started to disappear, too. Not just passengers, but crew members as well. A couple of waiters, some deckhands, they were all gone without a trace. No one mentioned them. No announcements. It was like they had never existed. Then came the night that everything changed. I had been restless all day, feeling like something terrible was about to happen. Around midnight, I heard a knock on my cabin door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was testing to see if I was awake. I was so scared that I didn't move, didn't say a word. Then came the voice. "Let me in." It was a soft, raspy whisper, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I recognized the voice, but I couldn't place it. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't respond. Whoever it was, I didn't want to give them the chance to get inside. The door shook, and I could hear faint, muffled voices beyond the door, almost as if a crowd was gathering outside. It wasn't just one person. It was many. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but it had no signal. Panic set in. I heard footsteps again, this time much louder, moving away from my door, down the hallway. I took a deep breath, mustered up all my courage, and opened the door. There was no one there. But something had changed. The ship, it seemed, was moving differently now. Heavier, slower, as if weighed down by something dark. I made my way to the deck, convinced I had to see it for myself. Maybe if I could just get a look at what was happening, I could make sense of it. When I reached the top deck, I could hear a strange chanting, low and guttural. I stepped out onto the open deck and felt my breath catch in my throat. The water was churning below, swirling in unnatural patterns. And in the distance, I saw them, dozens of people, just standing there on the edge of the ship, staring out into the void. Their faces were pale and ghostly, like the woman I had seen. They moved in unison, swaying gently as if caught in some eerie rhythm. Then I heard the whisper again, this time louder. "Join us." I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, as if it had become part of the ship itself. I looked at the faces, hollow eyes staring back at me, and I understood. They weren't alive. They hadn't been alive for a long time. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, but when I finally snapped out of it, I ran. I ran back to my cabin and didn't stop until I was inside. I locked the door and fell to the floor, gasping for breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those dark, hollow eyes staring at me from the sea. I don't remember much after that. There was a chaotic scramble the next morning. I heard whispers of the ship being off course, of strange occurrences, of the captain going missing and passengers disappearing without a trace. I don't know how I got off that ship, but I'm grateful that I did. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure. The sea isn't just water. There are things in it, things that should never be disturbed, and that ship, it wasn't just haunted, it was a place where the dead never truly left. So if you ever find yourself on a cruise and you feel that cold shiver run down your spine, that eerie sense of being watched, don't ignore it, because the spirits of the sea might be closer than you think.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a dream vacation, something that would break the monotony of my life. A luxury cruise through the Mediterranean. I had seen the ads, heard the rave reviews, and couldn't wait to finally step aboard. The ship was massive, an almost floating city, filled with everything you could imagine. A casino, shopping malls, endless buffets, pools, and even a theater. It felt like paradise. The first few days passed in a blur. I made friends at the bars that enjoyed the excursions to the islands and spent my nights at the elegant dinner tables. But on the fourth night, things started to feel different. The atmosphere on board began to shift in a way I couldn't quite describe. There was something off in the air, an unease I couldn't shake, even though the ship was bustling with people. It was after dinner when I first noticed it. I had gone up to the deck to watch the stars. The sky was clear, and the moonlight made the ocean shimmer. I was alone, and I felt a sense of peace, a rare moment of solitude that was hard to come by on a crowded cruise ship. But as I stood there, gazing out into the vastness of the sea, I felt someone, watching me. I turned around quickly, but the deck was empty. I didn't see anyone. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I shrugged it off, trying to ignore the unease, but it lingered. I made my way back to my cabin, hoping a good night's sleep would clear my mind. The next morning, I woke up late. There was an announcement over the intercom, something about a delayed port of call. I went to the breakfast buffet, trying to shake off the odd feelings from the night before. As I grabbed a plate of eggs and toast, I noticed the staff was acting strangely, unusually quiet, even nervous. One of the servers avoided eye contact, and another seemed to be talking to herself under her breath. I asked one of the crew members what was going on, but she just smiled nervously and said, "Everything was fine. Don't worry about it," she added, as if that would make me feel better. It didn't. Later that day, I tried to relax by the pool, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started noticing more people acting strangely. More crew members looking over their shoulders, guests whispering to each other in hushed tones as if they were all in on something I didn't know about. Then, as I was walking back to my cabin, I passed a group of passengers standing around a map of the ship, talking urgently in low voices. Their conversation stopped as soon as I walked by, and they turned away quickly as if they were hiding something from me. That night, I went to the bar for a drink, trying to relax, but my mind kept racing. I couldn't stop thinking about all the strange occurrences. That's when I met Sarah, a woman who seemed just as uneasy as I was. She was sitting alone at a table in the corner, her eyes darting around nervously. I took the opportunity to sit down and ask if she was okay. She looked at me with a tired expression, her face pale and drawn. "I don't know what's happening on this ship," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I've been on a lot of cruises, but this one, it's different. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like we're not alone here, like something's watching us." I was taken aback by her words, but the way she spoke, her voice trembling, made me believe her. We talked for a while, and she told me about the strange dreams she had been having. Dreams of people in old-fashioned clothes, standing in the hallways, staring at her from the corners of her room. People who weren't there when she opened her eyes. "I thought it was just me," she said, looking around nervously, "but I've seen other people looking like they've seen the same things. and they're all so quiet about it, like they don't want to admit it, like they're too scared. I tried to reassure her, but the unease that had been building inside me all week suddenly grew stronger. That night, I went back to my cabin, the hallways eerily quiet. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing noises outside my door, scraping sounds, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I called the front desk to ask if there was any maintenance going on, but the line was dead. Just static. The next morning, I woke up to a ship-wide announcement. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We regret to inform you that we will be skipping today's port of call. We apologize for the inconvenience and assure you that everything is fine. It was the same message again and again, repeating over the intercom. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't. Later that day, I decided to go down to the lower decks, far from the crowds, to see if I could find any answers. The crew was unusually absent in these parts, and the silence was oppressive. As I walked through the long, empty hallways, I began to feel like I was being watched. I turned a corner and saw a man standing at the end of the hallway, staring at me. He was dressed in an old-fashioned naval uniform, his face pale and expressionless. He didn't move, just stood there watching me. I tried to approach, but as I did, he suddenly vanished, disappearing into thin air. I backed away, my heart racing. I ran back to my cabin, locking the door behind me. I called Sarah, desperate for answers, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I grabbed my things and went to the captain's office, hoping for some explanation. But when I got there, the door was locked. I pounded on it, but no one answered. It was then that I noticed something strange. On the door, scratched into the wood, were symbols, old and worn, almost like they had been carved there years ago. I turned around and ran to the deck, hoping for some fresh air to clear my mind. But when I stepped outside, everything felt different. The sky had darkened, the air thick and oppressive. The ship had stopped moving. I looked around, but there was no sign of land. Nothing but an endless expanse of water. I felt a cold hand grab my shoulder, and I spun around to find Sarah standing there, her face white as a sheet. "It's happening," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's happening to all of us." Before I could ask what she meant, the ship's lights flickered and then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness. I heard screaming from the other passengers, the sound of feet pounding against the floors, but it was all muffled, distant, as if we were no longer on the same ship anymore. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness fell, the lights flickered back on and the ship was still. We were still floating, but it felt different, like the world around us had shifted, like we were no longer in the Mediterranean, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere we weren't supposed to be. Over the next few hours, I witnessed things I can't explain. Crew members and passengers were behaving strangely, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if they weren't in control of their own actions. People would disappear, only to reappear moments later. Their expressions blank, their movements stiff and unnatural. That night, I saw something I'll never forget. I was standing on the deck when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the ship, looking out over the water. It was the man I had seen earlier, in the naval uniform. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others with him, their faces covered by shadows, their eyes hollow. They were all staring at me, and for the first time I felt a bone-chilling fear. They weren't alive. They were something else. I turned and ran, but it was too late. I could hear their footsteps behind me, echoing through the empty halls. The ship wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it had no intention of letting us leave. That was the last time I saw daylight.
Next story.
It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. One of those vacations you dream about but never think will actually happen. A 7-day luxury cruise through the Caribbean, all expenses paid, the promise of relaxation and beautiful ocean views. I couldn't wait to unwind, to enjoy the breeze on deck and let my worries drift away like the waves. But what I didn't know, what no one could ever know, was that I was about to experience something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The first few days were incredible. The ship was massive, bigger than any hotel I had ever stayed in, with dozens of restaurants, bars, pools, a casino, and a full-fledged theater. There was no shortage of things to do. I remember the first night perfectly. After dinner, I went up to the deck to watch the sunset, feeling the sea breeze wash over me as I gazed at the endless expanse of water. That's when I saw something strange. There was a figure standing by the railing at the edge of the ship. At first, I thought it was just another passenger, but there was something off about them. The figure wasn't moving. I couldn't make out their features, just a silhouette against the fading light. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe they were just caught up in the view. But as the night went on, something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, the way they stood so still, like they were waiting for something. I asked a crew member if anyone had been out on the deck at that time, and he looked at me strangely, almost nervously. "No one was there," he said. "It's a restricted area." That's when the unease began to set in, though I didn't fully understand why. The crew member seemed so rattled, so I thought it might just be a misunderstanding. I let it go. But as the days passed, the odd occurrences began piling up. I started hearing noises late at night. It wasn't the usual hum of the ship's engines or the soft lapping of waves. It was a low, guttural sound, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it didn't sound human. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I'd turn on the light and the room would be empty, but the feeling never went away. One night, I decided to get some fresh air. It was after midnight and the halls were eerily quiet. I took the elevator down to the lower levels of the ship where I hadn't been before. The hallways seemed darker, less populated. I found myself walking past rooms that were strangely silent, even though I knew the ship was packed with passengers. The air felt heavier here, like something was pressing down on me. I walked down one of the narrow corridors, and that's when I saw her. A woman, pale, almost ghostly, with dark hair falling in matted clumps around her face. She was standing in front of a door, her hand resting on the handle, but she wasn't moving. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing in particular. There was something unsettling about her, something unnatural. She looked like she had been there for ages, stuck in time. I froze, unsure of what to do. I should have turned around and walked away, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from her. It was like she was pulling me in, like she wanted me to see something, to understand something that I couldn't quite grasp. Before I could say anything, the woman turned slowly, her gaze meeting mine. Her eyes were dark, hollow, like they had seen things that no one should ever witness. "Don't go down there," she whispered, her voice raspy and strained, like she hadn't spoken in years. "They'll find you. They'll never let you go." I felt a chill run through my spine. I didn't know what she meant, but I could feel the terror in her words, in the way her hands shook as they gripped the door handle. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, alone in the hallway. I ran back to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked the door behind me and tried to sleep, but the fear kept me awake. My mind raced, wondering who that woman was, why she looked so frightened. The next morning, I asked a few crew members about the woman, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. "There are no women like that on the ship," they insisted. "You must have been imagining things." But I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. As the days passed, the strange occurrences continued. More whispers in the halls, more fleeting glimpses of figures in the corners of my vision. One night, I woke up to find my room filled with an overpowering, acrid smell, like something rotting. When I looked around, everything seemed fine. Nothing was out of place. But the smell lingered, and I could feel the presence of something watching me from the shadows. It wasn't until the 5th day that I truly understood what was happening. The ship had docked at one of the islands for a day trip, and I decided to take a break from the chaos. I stayed behind, walking around the ship alone, trying to clear my mind. I wandered to the lower decks again, to the area where I had seen the woman before. This time there was no one in sight, but I felt it. The cold, suffocating air that pressed against me, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I followed the sensation, walking down a narrow staircase into a forgotten part of the ship. It was dark and damp, the walls lined with rusted pipes and metal doors. The ship creaked as if it were alive, groaning under some invisible weight. I reached a small, locked door, barely noticeable, tucked away in the corner of the hallway. It was old, its wood warped and rotting. I didn't know why I did it, but I reached out and touched the door. The instant my hand made contact, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by a low, eerie moan. The door creaked open by itself, revealing a room that was pitch black. I stepped inside, feeling the cold air rush around me, as if the room had been untouched for decades. And then I saw it. The walls of the room were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like blood. In the center of the room was a rusted, broken chair, and chained to it was a figure, hunched over and lifeless. The figure was skeletal, its skin stretched tight against its bones. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes, dead and empty, staring straight into me. And then I heard it. A voice, raspy and hollow, whispering my name. "Get out." I turned and ran, stumbling over my own feet as I sprinted through the darkened hallways. I didn't stop until I reached the upper decks, gasping for breath. But the terror didn't leave. It clung to me, the weight of what I had seen, the feeling of something chasing me. That night, I packed my bags and went to the captain, demanding to leave the ship. But when I reached the front desk, the crew members acted as though nothing had happened. No one seemed to know anything about the lower decks, the locked rooms, or the people I had seen. They all looked at me like I was losing my mind. The captain wasn't available, and the staff seemed to grow increasingly evasive when I asked about the ship's history. It was as if they were hiding something, as if they didn't want me to know what was really going on. I don't know what happened to that ship, what kind of darkness lies within its hull. But I know one thing for sure. It wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. I've never set foot on a cruise ship again, and I never will. The stories are true, the ghosts are real, and they'll find you no matter where you hide.
Next story.
I had always heard the rumors about the ghost ship stories, those eerie tales of people vanishing from cruises, strange things happening on board, and mysterious disappearances. But I never thought they were real. Not until I went on that fateful cruise. It was supposed to be a simple vacation, a chance to escape my stressful life and enjoy some peace on the open ocean. But the moment I stepped on that ship, everything changed. I remember the excitement as I boarded the ship. It was beautiful, the kind of place you'd see in a luxury magazine. Gleaming white walls, crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceilings, and a crew that looked like they had just stepped out of a dream. I was given my cabin key. A small, cozy room with a window that overlooked the vast, endless sea. I unpacked my things, excited for the week ahead. It wasn't until the second night that things started to get strange. I had been drinking at the bar with a few other guests, chatting about our experiences on board. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I noticed an odd man sitting at the corner of the bar. He was older, with graying hair and a worn leather jacket, but his eyes were the strangest part. They were hollow, almost empty, like he wasn't fully there. I tried not to pay attention to him, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, his gaze heavy, cold. At one point, he stood up and walked toward me. I thought he was going to speak, but instead he just gave me a slow, deliberate smile that sent chills down my spine. I nodded awkwardly, trying to look away, but he didn't leave. He just stood there, silently observing me as if waiting for something. Eventually, the moment passed, and I excused myself, heading back to my cabin to get some rest. But as I walked through the narrow hallway, I noticed something odd. The ship was completely silent. No crew members, no guests, just the soft hum of the ship's engines beneath my feet. I glanced at the doors to the cabins, and that's when I saw it. One of the doors was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer and pushed the door open, not knowing what to expect. Inside was a room that looked like any other, except for the strange, dusty smell that lingered in the air. The bed was neatly made, the room perfectly still, but there was something off about it, something wrong. As I stepped inside, I heard the unmistakable sound of a low, guttural voice, whispering. The words were unintelligible, a language I didn't recognize. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart raced in my chest, and every instinct told me to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I looked around, trying to find the source of the voice, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, draped in shadows. I couldn't make out the details, but I could feel its presence. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as the figure slowly moved toward me. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. The floorboards, the walls, they were covered in strange symbols, markings I didn't recognize. I stepped back, my heart pounding. But before I could make a move, the figure lunged toward me, its hands reaching out with unnatural speed. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and barely made it out of the room. I slammed the door shut behind me, panting, my head spinning with fear. But when I looked down the hallway, the eerie silence returned, and the door I had just opened was now locked tight. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the ship. I ran to my cabin, locked the door, and tried to shake off the fear. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing the whispers, the sound of someone or something moving around in the darkness just beyond my reach. Every time I opened my eyes, I was sure I saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, but when I looked directly at them, there was nothing there. The next day, I asked the crew about the strange room I had found, but they denied any knowledge of it. There were no empty cabins on that deck, they insisted. I even showed them the key card that opened the door, but they just shrugged it off. Must have been a mistake, they said, though their eyes seemed to shift nervously as they spoke. But that wasn't the end of it. As the days passed, I began to feel like I was being followed. It wasn't just in the hallways anymore. It was in my dreams, too. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The whispers would return, louder this time, echoing through my mind, calling my name. One evening, I decided to confront the strange man at the bar. Maybe he knew something, I thought. Maybe he had answers. I found him sitting alone as usual, staring into his glass. I sat down beside him and asked him what he knew about the ship. To my surprise, he didn't look at me at first. He just kept staring into his drink, lost in thought. "It's not what you think," he finally said, his voice raspy and low. "This ship, it's cursed. It was built on an old, forgotten land where strange rituals were performed. There are things on board that you can't understand. They come for you when the ship is alone, when the passengers are asleep, when the night is at its darkest." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head. "You'll see for yourself soon enough. The ship will claim you, too. It always does." I tried to laugh it off, but deep down I knew he was serious, and I couldn't ignore the mounting sense of dread that had been building inside me since I boarded. Something was happening on this ship, something that no one wanted to talk about. And it wasn't just the eerie whispers. It was the way the crew seemed to avoid certain areas, the way they acted strangely when I asked about the ship's past. They all knew something, but no one would say anything. That night, I decided to explore the ship further, to uncover the truth. I ventured to the lower decks, the parts of the ship I had avoided before. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the bowels of the ship, and the hallways became narrower, more claustrophobic. The lights flickered above me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move as if alive. And that's when I found it, a door, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the ship. The key card I had been given for my room worked on this door as well. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside was another room, but this one was different. It wasn't just strange, it was ancient. The walls were covered in faded murals, depicting strange rituals and symbols I couldn't understand. In the center of the room was an altar, covered in dark stains that I didn't want to identify. And on the far side of the room, a figure stood, facing away from me. It was the same figure from before, the one I had seen in the hall. This time, though, it didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to understand. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and fled, running through the darkened halls, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next morning, I was gone. They never found me, never even noticed that I had disappeared. As far as they know, I just vanished into thin air. But I know the truth. That ship, it's cursed. It takes what it wants and it doesn't let go.
Next story.
It was a chance encounter, a random decision that changed everything. I had never been one to sign up for something like this, an all-inclusive cruise to some remote part of the Caribbean. But when my sister, Ashley, convinced me to come along, I reluctantly agreed. It was supposed to be a break from the chaos of my life, a few days of sunshine and relaxation. Little did I know, it would become a nightmare that would haunt me forever. From the moment we boarded, I knew something felt off. The ship was grand, but there was something almost unnatural about it. The decorations were extravagant, but the colors were a bit too vibrant, the carvings a little too intricate, like they had been hastily thrown together to create an illusion of beauty. The air was heavy, thick with a scent I couldn't place. Something like salt water, mixed with old wood, a strange metallic tang. But that was just the beginning. We spent the first day at sea, and everything seemed fine, at least on the surface. People were having fun, enjoying the pool, the food, the drinks. But as the sun began to set, that was when things started to take a turn. The lights on the ship began flickering, almost rhythmically, like a pulse. It wasn't an inconvenience at first, just a flicker here and there. But after a while, it started to feel deliberate, like the ship itself was alive. I found Ashley on the upper deck, sitting by the railing, her eyes lost in thought as she gazed out at the vast ocean. The night was quiet, too quiet, and the darkness stretched endlessly in every direction. I walked over to her, noticing how pale she looked. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just thinking." I glanced out at the ocean, trying to shake off the strange unease that had started to build in my chest. But then something caught my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the deck just beyond the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, long hair flowing down her back like a veil. She stood motionless, staring out into the endless dark, unmoving. "Who's that?" I asked, nudging Ashley. Ashley's head snapped to the figure, but the woman was gone. No sign of her anywhere. "What are you talking about?" Ashley asked, her voice tight. "I swear there was a woman standing right there, looking out at the water," I said, now feeling foolish. "Maybe she's one of the crew members?" Ashley gave a nervous laugh. "I don't think so." Before I could say anything else, the lights flickered again, this time for a full minute. I grabbed Ashley's arm, feeling a jolt of anxiety shoot through me. "Let's head inside. This is freaking me out." We made our way to the nearest door, stepping into the brightly lit interior of the ship. As soon as we entered, though, I could feel the tension in the air, thick as tar. The crew members were all moving in perfect unison, too precise in their actions. They weren't talking, weren't laughing, just mechanical, as if they were part of the ship itself, moving as though programmed to do so. I pulled Ashley down a hallway to a nearby lounge, hoping the change of scenery would make me feel better. But when we stepped inside, it was completely empty. Not a soul. The music was still playing, but the sound seemed muffled, distorted, like it was coming from far away. There was a chill in the air, even though the ship was warm and humid outside. "Is it just me, or does this place feel wrong?" I muttered. Ashley didn't answer. She was staring at something on the far side of the room, her eyes wide with disbelief. I followed her gaze, and what I saw made my stomach drop. A man. But not just any man. He was sitting at a table, his back to us, wearing a dark coat that looked like it belonged in another era. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his presence, as though he was waiting for something, or someone. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Excuse me?" I called, my voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Ashley reached for my arm, pulling me back. "We need to get out of here." I was about to argue, but then the lights went out. Completely. A pitch-black darkness engulfed us, and I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking right toward us. I held my breath, my body frozen in place, and then a voice. Low, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send shivers down my spine. "Stay with us," I gasped, and suddenly the lights snapped back on, bright and blinding. The man was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered, thick and suffocating, as if something was watching us from the shadows. Ashley grabbed my arm, her face pale. "We need to leave, now." We ran back down the hall and into the nearest stairwell, our footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. But when we tried to head toward our cabin, we found that the hallways had changed. The layout of the ship seemed wrong. The doors were different. The walls were a different color. It was as though we had stepped into another world entirely, one that didn't belong on this ship. I tried to call for help, but the ship's phone lines were dead. No response from anyone. No one was around, no crew, no passengers. Just silence. We found our cabin eventually, and when we opened the door, we realized it wasn't the cabin we had left earlier. Everything was in disarray. The bed sheets were torn, and the furniture had been moved around as if someone had ransacked the room. The window was cracked, and the cold night air was seeping in. And that's when we heard it, a soft whisper. So faint, we could barely make it out. "Leave now." I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was coming from inside the room as though someone was standing right behind us. But there was no one there. Ashley was visibly shaking now. "I don't like this. I don't want to be here anymore." I didn't argue. We grabbed our bags, and without even thinking, we ran out of the cabin and into the hallway. The ship was alive now, its walls shifting, the floors creaking under our weight. The sounds of whispers grew louder, more insistent, like the ship itself was trying to pull us in. We made our way to the deck, desperate to get off, but when we reached the edge, we found the exit sealed shut. No lifeboats, no escape. And that's when we saw them. The figures, dozens of them, standing at the far end of the deck, watching us with those same hollow, empty eyes. The same man we had seen earlier, the same woman in the white gown. They started to move toward us, slowly, methodically, like they had been waiting for us all along. "Help us," they whispered in unison. I grabbed Ashley's arm and pulled her to the side, hoping to find another way out, but there was no way out. The ship was no longer a ship. It was a trap, a prison, and we were its captives. I don't know what happened after that. One moment we were running, the next, darkness. When I woke up, I was back in my cabin, but it wasn't the same. The ship was no longer sailing. The ocean was gone. We were somewhere else, in a place that didn't exist on any map. We are still here, trapped on the ship, with the whispers growing louder every day. The crew is no longer human. The passengers, they've all disappeared, replaced by hollow-eyed figures who speak in riddles. And the worst part is, I know that we are part of the ship now. We're part of the curse, the endless cycle of people who were never meant to leave. The ship is waiting for the next group of souls to come aboard to join us in the darkness.
Next story.
I should have known it was too good to be true. I had been planning this vacation for months, eagerly awaiting my first ever cruise. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a break from everything back home that felt so exhausting. The brochures promised endless fun, exotic destinations, luxurious amenities, and a chance to meet new people. The ship was state-of-the-art, equipped with everything a traveler could want. Pools, spas, nightclubs, even a theater. I thought I was going to have the time of my life. Instead, I found myself trapped in a nightmare. The first few days were nothing special. Just your typical cruise, people lounging by the pool, enjoying meals at fancy restaurants, and taking in the beautiful ocean views. My roommate, Emily, and I spent most of our days sunbathing and chatting with strangers. The nightlife was vibrant, and we even joined a couple of onboard parties. It was all fun and games, until we hit a storm on the fourth night. At first, the storm seemed harmless enough. The ship rocked a little, but nothing too unusual for a cruise. Most of the passengers didn't seem worried. But as the night wore on, the storm grew stronger. The wind howled outside and rain pounded against the ship's windows. The crew made several announcements, reassuring us that everything was under control. Then, around midnight, everything changed. Emily and I were in our cabin, trying to sleep, when the power flickered. The lights went out for a few seconds, plunging the room into darkness. I reached for the lamp next to the bed, but it didn't turn on. Just as I was about to get up and check the lights, I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible knocking on the door. Knock, 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 knock. I froze. I didn't know who could be at the door at this hour, especially with the storm raging outside. I called out, but there was no response. I got up cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked through the peephole, I saw nothing, just the empty hallway. Confused and a little uneasy, I opened the door. There was no one in sight. I closed the door and locked it again, thinking it was probably just some prank. But then the knocking came again. This time it was more urgent. Knock, knock, knock. Louder, faster. I turned to Emily, who was now awake. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She nodded, looking frightened. "What is it? Should we call someone?" Before I could answer, the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, eerie sound. It was like whispering. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely there. I moved closer to the door and pressed my ear to it, hoping to hear better. The whispering became clearer, and I could hear a voice. A woman's voice. "Help me, please." I felt a chill run down my spine. My stomach twisted. Who was that? Why were they asking for help? I wanted to call the front desk, but something held me back. I don't know what it was. Fear, curiosity, or something else entirely. But I reached for the door again. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't what happened next. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, just like before. But as I stepped into the corridor, I noticed something strange. The atmosphere felt heavy, suffocating. The ship's usual hum was gone. The storm outside continued to rage, but the ship had become eerily silent. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, I saw her. At the far end of the hallway, standing just under a flickering light, was a woman. Her back was to me, but I could tell she was staring at something. At nothing, really. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, like something out of a different time. Her hair was wet, hanging limp around her shoulders, and she didn't seem to notice me standing there. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there. "Emily," I whispered, but my voice sounded distant, like I was underwater. "Look." I turned to Emily, but when I looked back toward the woman, she was gone. I blinked, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light. But when I looked around again, the hallway was still empty. I wanted to go back to the cabin, lock the door, and forget everything. But something was pulling me forward. I walked down the hallway cautiously, my breath quickening with each step. As I passed the doors of other cabins, I heard faint murmurs coming from behind them. But they weren't normal sounds. It wasn't laughter or conversations. It was crying, whimpering, pleading. "Help me." The voice sounded like the woman from earlier. I quickened my pace, not wanting to linger. But as I neared the end of the hallway, I felt it again, the pressure, the weight of something invisible pushing down on me. I turned to face the direction I was walking and froze. There she was. The woman was standing at the very end of the hallway, facing me now. She was closer than I realized. Her eyes, they weren't human. They were dark, deep pools of black, as though her eyes had been replaced with voids. She was staring at me, her face expressionless. There was no emotion, no life in her gaze. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice low and raspy, like it had been trapped for years. I felt my body freeze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. Her voice filled my mind, echoing over and over again, drowning out everything else. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I wasn't looking at a woman. I was looking at something that wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. The hallway was plunged into complete darkness, and the temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath in front of me. The whispering turned into a low, guttural growl. My heart raced in my chest as I spun around, running back down the corridor, desperate to escape. I don't know how long I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the elevator. I pushed the button repeatedly, but it wouldn't come. The doors remained closed, and I could feel her presence behind me, the weight of her cold stare bearing down on me. I turned to look down the hallway once more, but the woman was gone. I finally reached my cabin, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed, heart pounding. Emily was sitting up, looking confused. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain that I had seen something that shouldn't be on this ship? The next morning, the storm had passed and the ship was calm again. Everything was back to normal, at least on the surface. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining things. I tried to speak to a crew member about it, but they brushed me off as though it was nothing more than a bad dream. I even asked about the woman I saw, but they told me there were no reports of anyone fitting that description. I don't know what happened to her or who or what she was. But I know one thing for sure. I never wanted to find out. After that night, I didn't stay on that ship for much longer. I disembarked at the next port, and I haven't stepped foot on another cruise since. There's something off about that ship, something that isn't right. And as for the whispers, I still hear them sometimes. Late at night, when the wind picks up, I hear her voice again, calling me from the darkness. "Help me."
Next story.
It was a small, quiet cruise. Not the extravagant kind you'd expect to see on the cover of travel magazines, but rather a quaint voyage through the Gulf of Alaska, perfect for those seeking solitude and breathtaking views. I didn't want anything grand, just a week away from the noise of city life and the constant demands of work. Little did I know, this trip would unravel into something far more sinister than I could have imagined. I boarded the ship on a bright morning. The vessel was smaller than I anticipated, only about 150 passengers, mostly elderly couples and a few families. It had the charm of a smaller, more intimate experience. The crew was friendly and the staff members knew the regular guests by name, greeting them like old friends. The ship had all the amenities you could need: a few restaurants, a cozy lounge, a small pool, and even a spa. I found my cabin on the lower deck. It was neat, if a bit outdated, but I didn't mind. I was on the water for the experience, not luxury. The ship set sail in the afternoon, and for the first couple of days it felt like paradise. The air was crisp, the sea calm, and the scenery was beyond description. But by the third night, things began to take an odd turn. I was just finishing up dinner when I noticed something strange. A guest at the table next to mine, an older man, kept glancing toward the hallway leading to the ship's rear. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and tapping his fingers against the table. Finally, after several minutes of silence, he stood up abruptly and walked out of the dining room. I watched him go, curious about his strange behavior. After finishing my meal, I decided to go for a walk around the deck to clear my mind. The sky had darkened and a thick fog began to roll in from the sea, enveloping the ship. I strolled along the railing, my footsteps muffled by the fog. The air grew colder, and for a moment I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. I was alone on the deck with only the faint sound of the ship's engines and the occasional call of a distant bird. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, as if someone was moaning in pain. I froze, straining my ears to listen. It was coming from below, somewhere deep in the ship. At first, I thought it might be the creaking of the ship's hull, but then I heard it again. Closer this time, and unmistakably human. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the noise, descending to the lower levels of the ship. The lower decks were eerily quiet. The corridor was dimly lit by flickering bulbs, casting long shadows on the walls. As I moved further down, I saw a door slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light escape from within. The moaning was louder now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I knocked gently, but there was no answer. The moaning stopped, but a shuffling noise replaced it, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. My heart was pounding as I pushed the door open. Inside, I was met with a chilling sight. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair in the corner, slowly moving back and forth as though someone had just been sitting in it. But what made my blood run cold was the figure in the center of the room. A man, hunched over, his back turned to me. His clothes were tattered, as if they had been worn for years. His hair was long and matted, and his hands were gripping the edge of the chair tightly. He made no sound as I stood frozen in the doorway, watching him. I was about to speak, to ask if he was okay, when suddenly, he turned. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull. He had a faint smile on his lips, but it wasn't comforting. It was twisted, like something out of a nightmare. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice rasping like sandpaper against stone. His words chilled me to the bone. "They're watching." Before I could react, the man stood up with a sudden, jerky movement. His body was unnaturally stiff, like he had been frozen for years. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. The light above flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. In a flash, he lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, barely avoiding his grasp. My heart was racing as I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. I ran up the stairs, not stopping until I reached the main deck again. The fresh air hit me like a wave, but it did nothing to calm my frayed nerves. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was I imagining it? I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. There was something deeply wrong with this ship. The next morning, I tried to push the encounter to the back of my mind. I joined some of the other passengers for breakfast, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. The ship's atmosphere felt heavier. The crew seemed distracted, their faces pale, their movements slow and deliberate. Even the passengers, once lively and chatty, appeared on edge like they were all waiting for something. That night, I decided to confront the situation head on. I went back to the lower decks, determined to find out more. I knew there was something hidden there, something that was making everyone on board so anxious. As I made my way toward the bowels of the ship, I noticed more and more crew members standing at the doors to the cabins, whispering to each other in low tones. When they saw me approaching, they quickly fell silent and turned away, as though trying to hide something. I descended deeper into the ship, past the rooms, and into the service corridors. It was there that I saw them, 3 figures cloaked in tattered, old-fashioned uniforms. They were standing in front of a door, staring at it with cold, unblinking eyes. The door was different from the others. It was old, the wood warped and cracked, and the symbol of a ship's wheel was carved into the doorframe. As I stepped closer, the figures turned in unison, their faces pale and drawn. "You shouldn't have come," Dina, one of them said in a voice that sounded like a whisper from the grave. "It's too late now." Before I could react, the door creaked open, revealing a small room filled with old nautical equipment, ropes, chains, and a rusted anchor. But it wasn't the contents of the room that caught my attention. It was the air. It was thick, suffocating, as if something ancient and malevolent was trapped within. And in the far corner, I saw it. A man, bound in chains, his eyes wide and frantic, staring at me. His body was twisted, contorted as though in constant agony. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. "It's real," he managed to whisper. "It's all real." Before I could ask what he meant, the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. The next morning, the ship docked, and I hurried to disembark, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. As I left the ship, I saw the same man, the one who had been in the room, standing by the pier. But he wasn't chained anymore. His eyes were hollow and dead, his face a grimace of pain. He caught my gaze and whispered one final warning before he disappeared into the crowd. "Don't look back," he said, but I did.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple family vacation, a week-long cruise to Alaska. My wife Sarah and I had been saving for months, and the excitement of the trip was palpable. We were joined by my 2 kids, Lily and Jack, and Sarah's parents. The ship was massive, and for the first few days, it was everything we had hoped for. Luxurious meals, stunning views of the glaciers, and evenings filled with laughter and entertainment. But then, something happened, something none of us could have ever expected. It started with the whispers. On the 4th night, I woke up in the middle of the night to an unsettling sound, low, soft whispers coming from the hallway outside our cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe some noise from the ship's engines, but the whispers seemed too deliberate, too human. I strained my ears to listen, but they were faint, as if someone was speaking in hushed tones just out of sight. I slid out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and stepped into the hallway. The ship was silent except for the distant murmur of conversation and the creak of the walls. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I started walking toward the stern of the ship, hoping to find the source. As I passed the ship's lounge, I noticed the lights flickering overhead, like they were struggling to stay on. The whispering intensified, almost to the point where it sounded like voices calling my name. "Jason. Jason." I froze in my tracks. That wasn't just a random whisper. It was my name. I turned around and the hallway behind me was empty. My heart started to pound in my chest. The whispering stopped, and for a moment, everything felt unnervingly still. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the isolation of being on a ship, but I decided to head back to my cabin. I didn't mention it to Sarah the next morning. I didn't want to worry her for no reason. But then the dreams started. That night, I woke up with a start, gasping for air. I had been dreaming of the sea, but not the tranquil beauty of Alaska's waters. This was something darker. The waves were churning violently, and there was a figure, a shadowy silhouette standing at the edge of a ship, staring out at the endless expanse of water. I couldn't see the figure's face, but I felt its presence. It was watching me. It was waiting for me. I didn't sleep well that night, and the feeling of dread only grew the next day. The whispers, now unmistakable, continued at odd hours, and I felt like I was being followed. Everywhere I went, I would catch glimpses of someone in the corners of my vision, just a flash of movement before it disappeared. It wasn't long before Sarah noticed I was acting strange. She asked me if I was okay, and I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. I told her about the whispers, but she dismissed it, suggesting maybe I was just stressed or hearing things. By the time we reached the next port, I was barely able to function. The whispers were constant, and they were no longer limited to the nighttime. I could hear them during the day, just beneath the noise of the ship, but no one else seemed to hear them. That's when Lily started to act strange. It was during our shore excursion in Juneau. The kids were playing in the kids' club while Sarah and I went on a guided hike. We returned to the ship around mid-afternoon, eager to share our experiences with the kids, but when we found Lily, she was sitting alone in a corner of the play area, staring at the wall. "Lily?" Sarah called out, crouching down to her level. Lily didn't respond at first. Then, in a soft, almost trance-like voice, she said, "They told me to come." "What do you mean, honey?" Sarah asked, confused. "They're waiting for us," Lily continued, her wide eyes never leaving the wall. "They want us to join them." A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't make sense of what she was saying. Sarah tried to snap Lily out of it, but the child's eyes were glazed over, her body rigid as though she was in some sort of trance. After a few moments, Lily blinked and looked around as if waking from a dream. "What's wrong, Mommy? Why are you looking at me like that?" That's when I knew something was wrong. Something was happening on that ship, and it wasn't just me. Later that night, I had a strange urge to investigate. I needed answers. I left Sarah and the kids asleep in the cabin and quietly made my way to the lower decks of the ship. I had no idea what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay below. I wandered down narrow corridors, past maintenance rooms, and into areas of the ship that felt old and abandoned. There were no crew members around, and the eerie quiet felt unnatural, as though the ship was holding its breath. The lights were dim, and the air smelled musty, like a place that had been forgotten. I reached a door at the end of the hallway, a heavy steel door with no signage. It was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the room was dark, but I could see the outline of something. A figure. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal. It stood in the middle of the room, facing the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer. Then the figure turned. Its face was gaunt, its skin an unnatural grayish blue, and its eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to suck in all the light around it. It opened its mouth, and I could hear the whispers again, but this time they were coming from its lips. It was speaking directly to me, but the words were incomprehensible, a garbled mess that made my skin crawl. I backed away in terror, but before I could turn to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. The figure advanced, moving with a strange, jerky motion. It pointed at me, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. My body went numb, as though I were sinking into cold water. The whispers were louder now, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The figure vanished. The door opened. The whispers faded into silence. I stumbled out of the room, my heart racing, and I ran back to my cabin as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was locked inside, shaking uncontrollably. The next day, I told Sarah everything. She didn't believe me at first, but when I showed her the area where the room was, it was gone. The hallway led to nowhere, and the door had been replaced with a solid wall. There was no trace of anything abnormal. We left the ship at the next port. I don't know what happened, but I can't shake the feeling that something, some ancient, malevolent force, was waiting beneath the surface of that ship. To this day, I don't know if I was just imagining it or if something truly paranormal was at play. But I'm certain of one thing. Whatever was on that ship, whatever I encountered, is still out there. And I pray I never have to face it again.
Next story.
I should have never agreed to go on that cruise. I know that now, but back then, it seemed like the perfect escape. After all, who wouldn't want to spend a week on the open sea, surrounded by luxury, with nothing to do but relax? My friends and I had been planning it for months, and everything sounded so enticing. The fine dining, the entertainment, the endless sunshine. Little did we know we were sailing into something far darker, than we could have imagined. The first few days were like a dream. We were on the water heading toward the Caribbean. Days were spent lounging by the pool, and at night we'd dress up and hit the nightclub. The ship was huge, like a floating city. It had everything: restaurants, pools, spas, a casino, even an art gallery. We were all so caught up in the glamour of it that we didn't even think to ask about the history of the ship. If we had, maybe we would have known better. It was on the fourth night that things started to feel off. I was in my cabin, just about to go to sleep, when I heard the knock. 3 knocks, soft and deliberate. At first, I thought it was my friend Michelle coming to ask me something, but when I opened the door, no one was there. The hallway outside was completely empty, eerily quiet. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but as I started to close the door, I heard it again. 3 knocks, this time louder, from the other side of the cabin. I was unnerved, but I opened the door again, expecting to see someone standing there. Still, no one. The hallway was empty again, like no one had been there at all. I closed the door and locked it, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing strange noises from somewhere in the room. The creaking of the floorboards, the distant hum of the ship's engines, and a whisper. Low and quiet, like someone was talking just behind me. I would turn around expecting to see someone, but there was no one. Nothing at all. The next morning, I went to breakfast with Michelle and the others, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, an unsettling quietness that seemed to linger wherever I went. The crew acted strangely, too. They were still friendly, but their smiles seemed forced, like they were hiding something. Whenever I passed certain areas of the ship, I noticed they'd glance over at me, sometimes even watch me as if they were expecting something to happen. Things got worse the following evening. It was around midnight when it all started. I woke up to the sound of the cabin door rattling, as if someone was trying to get in. I leapt out of bed, my heart racing, and rushed to the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing, but the knocking came again. 3 knocks, harder this time. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, but I couldn't ignore it. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. There was a cold chill in the air, a sharp, biting wind that shouldn't have been there. The air conditioning was fine, but the temperature felt wrong. It was as though something unnatural was present. The ship, despite being vast and packed with people, seemed eerily silent. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing against the metal walls, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the hall, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A person, or at least it looked like a person. But there was something off about them. Their skin was too pale, their clothes old and tattered, as though they hadn't been washed in years. They just stood there, motionless, staring at me. I called out, but the figure didn't move. Then the whispers started again. This time, they were clearer. "Help me! Help me!" The voice was faint, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was the same voice I'd heard the night before, but now it was pleading. Desperate. I could feel it. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. Before I could react, the figure moved. It glided toward me, faster than any human could move. I froze, unable to do anything but watch in horror as it drew closer. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel my breath turning to fog. My mind raced, but all I could think of was running. I turned and fled down the hall, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was following me. The whispers grew louder, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind me, getting closer with every step I took. I rounded a corner, nearly tripping over my own feet, and found myself in a part of the ship I didn't recognize. It was dark, and the walls looked different, like they hadn't been painted in years. The air smelled musty, like mildew, and I realized I was no longer in the main part of the ship. Panic set in. I didn't know where I was, and I was certain I was alone, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The whispers were deafening now, and the figure, I could feel it drawing closer, its presence suffocating. I looked around, desperate for an escape. That's when I saw the door, an old wooden door, half hidden behind a stack of forgotten crates. I ran toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. When I threw open the door, I was met with the worst sight of all. A room that should not have existed on a cruise ship. The walls were lined with old photographs, tattered, faded black and white images of people who looked long dead. Some were smiling, but their eyes were hollow, dark, and empty. Others were posed in what appeared to be old-fashioned ship attire, standing proudly on the deck of the ship. But there was something wrong about the photos. The people, they looked like they were trapped, like they were begging for help even though they couldn't move. Suddenly, I felt the cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, and saw the figure. It was standing right behind me, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were dark, empty sockets, and its mouth twisted into an eerie, wide grin. "Help me," it whispered again. "Please," I screamed, slamming the door shut behind me and running out of the room, not daring to look back. When I reached the main part of the ship, I found a crew member and begged him to help. He looked at me like I was crazy, but when I told him about the room, about the photos and the figure, his face changed. He grew pale and he glanced nervously around. "You shouldn't have gone there," he muttered. "It's not safe. It's best to forget." He wouldn't say anything more, and I didn't push him. I didn't care to know anymore, not after everything I just experienced. I left the ship the next morning, convinced that I had somehow narrowly escaped whatever haunted that place. I never went back on a cruise again. To this day, I wonder if the ship was cursed. I wonder if there was something about it, something dark and malevolent, that still lingers, waiting for the next passenger to step into the wrong place at the wrong time. And I still hear the whispers. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear them, just out of reach, always calling my name, begging for help.
Next story.
I was never one to believe in ghosts. My family and friends always joked about my skepticism, how I could never be swayed by the stories they told. They'd share their haunted house experiences, eerie encounters in old hotels, or tales of the supernatural. I would always brush them off, dismissing it as mere imagination or coincidence. That was until I found myself on a cruise ship in the middle of the Caribbean, far from the familiar shores of home, with nothing but the vast, dark ocean surrounding us. It was a last-minute decision to go. My wife Claire had insisted we take a break from our busy lives, just a few days of relaxation, away from the demands of work and family. The cruise was supposed to be an escape, an opportunity to unwind. And at first it was. The ship was beautiful, elegant, with grandiose staircases and open decks that offered incredible views of the sea. The food was superb and the crew was friendly, but there was something off about the ship, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started on the third night. We were having dinner in one of the ship's upscale restaurants. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, and Claire and I were chatting with another couple we had met during the trip. It was the perfect evening, until the lights flickered. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a small flicker, but then the power cut out completely. The room was plunged into darkness and a hushed silence fell over the diners. Moments later, the lights came back on and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I glanced around the room and everyone seemed disoriented, unsure of what had just happened. But the oddest part was that when the lights flickered back on, there was a man standing at the far end of the room. He wasn't there before. I knew he wasn't. We had been sitting at a table in full view of the entire room. There was no way anyone could have entered unnoticed. The man was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned naval uniform, his face pale and gaunt. He stood perfectly still, staring out of the large windows that framed the dining room. His eyes were unblinking, his expression unreadable. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but a chill crawled up my spine. "Who is that?" I asked, my voice low. Claire followed my gaze, her brow furrowing in confusion. I don't know. I didn't see him before." I turned back to the man, but he was gone, disappeared as if he had never been there. The odd thing was, no one seemed to notice his absence. The other diners were talking again, resuming their conversations as though nothing had happened. But the feeling in the room had changed. It felt heavy now, like something was lurking just beyond our perception. I couldn't shake the image of the man in the uniform. But I didn't want to say anything more to Claire. She was already feeling uneasy, and I didn't want to freak her out. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was around 2 a.m., and the ship was quiet, too quiet. The gentle hum of the engines was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. I heard a soft tapping sound coming from somewhere in the cabin. My first thought was that it was just the ship creaking, but then I heard it again, louder, more deliberate. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up, trying to locate the source. The tapping was coming from the bathroom. Hesitant, I crept toward the door, my hand on the handle. I paused, listening for any other sounds. Tap, tap, tap. I opened the door slowly, and there, sitting on the edge of the sink, was the man. His ghostly figure was unmistakable, pale, gaunt, with his empty eyes fixed on me. He wasn't moving, but his presence was undeniable. I froze, unable to breathe, feeling the weight of his gaze. "What do you want?" I whispered, but my voice was barely audible. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the mirror above the sink, and as he did, the reflection in the glass was different. It was no longer just him standing there. It was a group of men, all dressed in the same naval uniforms, their faces just as pale, just as lifeless. They were staring back at me from the mirror, their hollow eyes unblinking, their forms indistinct, like figures drawn in mist. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't look away, even though every fiber of my being screamed to run. The tapping continued, rhythmic and constant, as if it were coming from the mirror itself. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room plunged into darkness. I scrambled to the light switch, fumbling with my hands until the bulb flickered on. But when the light returned, the bathroom was empty. No man. No reflections. The room was just as it had been before. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed awake for hours, eyes fixed on the door, listening for any sound. When morning finally came, I told Claire what had happened, but she didn't believe me. She thought it was just a bad dream, a result of too much wine or exhaustion. I tried to convince her, but deep down, I knew she wasn't going to accept it. Over the next few days, I tried to forget what I'd seen. But the encounters didn't stop. I began seeing the man everywhere, walking the hallways when no one else was around, standing by the railing on the deck, his cold gaze always fixed on me. Sometimes I would hear his voice, soft, barely a whisper, but always urging me to follow him. One evening, Claire and I attended a show in the ship's theater. The performance was fine, but as I sat there, I felt the familiar presence again. I looked to the side, and sure enough, the man was sitting in the row behind us. His eyes were locked on mine, and I could feel the pull of his gaze. I turned to Claire, grabbing her arm. "Claire, we need to leave, right now." She stared at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" The show just started. But I couldn't take it anymore. We left, and as soon as we stepped into the hallway, the man vanished. We made our way back to our cabin, and I told Claire everything. This time, she saw the fear in my eyes. She couldn't deny it any longer. That night, we packed our things and left the ship in the early hours of the morning, disembarking at the nearest port. We didn't look back. As we left the harbor, I could have sworn I saw the man one last time, standing at the edge of the dock, watching us as we sailed away. His cold, lifeless eyes never left us. I don't know what happened on that ship, or why I was the one who saw the ghost. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that vessel. It's been years since that trip, but sometimes in the quietest moments, I still hear the soft tapping, the whisper of a voice, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free of the ghost that haunted the sea.
Next story.
I never believed in the supernatural, at least not until my cruise to the Caribbean last summer. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, just a relaxing trip away from work and stress. My friends and I were so excited to escape to sunny beaches and crystal clear waters, with endless food and entertainment on the ship. But what was supposed to be paradise quickly turned into a nightmare. One I can't forget no matter how hard I try. It all started the first night at sea. The ship was enormous, and the crew was friendly. We had a lovely dinner, explored the ship, and then decided to hit the club for a few drinks. By midnight, I was feeling a little tipsy, so I decided to head back to my cabin to sleep. My friends stayed behind, and I walked down the long corridor alone, humming to myself as I passed by the doors of other rooms. As I was walking, I noticed something strange. One of the doors was slightly ajar. Normally, I wouldn't think twice, but something about it made me pause. The room was dark inside, and I could hear soft voices coming from within. I peered in, curious, but saw nothing, just an empty room. The door was slowly creaking back and forth as if someone had just been standing there. I shook my head and laughed it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps I was imagining things. But then, as I turned to walk away, I felt a chill run up my spine, like someone was watching me. I froze. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, soft and slow, coming from the room I had just passed. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest. I kept walking, but the footsteps grew louder, as though they were following me. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, trying to shake off the dread creeping up my throat. The hallway felt longer than before. The walls seemed to close in around me. I reached for my room key, fumbling with it in my hand, but before I could unlock the door, I heard a voice, low, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." I turned around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. I opened the door to my cabin quickly, locking it behind me. I looked around nervously, as though expecting someone or something to be lurking in the shadows. But everything was still. The room was silent. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself I was just exhausted. I quickly changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, determined to forget about the strange occurrence. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made me jump. The air felt unnaturally cold, and I kept hearing strange noises, scratching sounds like something or someone was moving around just beyond my reach. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to a loud bang coming from across the room. I sat up straight in bed, my heart racing again. The lights flickered and the room grew colder, so cold I could see my breath. I grabbed the blanket and wrapped it around me, trying to calm myself, but the banging persisted. It sounded like it was coming from the closet. I told myself it was probably just the ship creaking. But then I heard the voice again, this time louder, more desperate. "Help me. Please. Help." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just in my head. Someone or something was speaking to me from inside the closet. I hesitated, my mind racing with all the possible explanations, but something deep down told me I had to look. I had no choice. Slowly, I stood up, clutching the blanket to my chest, and walked toward the closet. The banging had stopped, replaced by soft, slow breathing. I reached for the handle and hesitated, my fingers trembling. Then, with a deep breath, I pulled it open. Nothing. The closet was empty, just clothes hanging neatly in the dark. I exhaled in relief, thinking maybe I had just imagined everything. But then I felt it. Cold, icy air rushing past me. The temperature in the room had dropped drastically, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. A figure stepped out from the shadows at the back of the closet. It was a woman, pale, with long, wet hair hanging in front of her face. She wore a tattered white dress, soaked as though she had been underwater for days. Her eyes were wide open, empty black pits where her pupils should be. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice hoarse and crackling. I screamed and stumbled back, but she reached out, her cold skeletal hand grabbing my arm. Her grip was stronger than I could have imagined. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. Her touch felt like ice, freezing my skin. "Please, you have to help me," she whispered, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of decay. I couldn't move. My mind was racing, and I knew I had to get away. I kicked her, pushed against her with all my strength, and finally, she released me, stumbling back into the shadows. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to find the crew, to tell someone what happened, but when I tried to call the front desk, the line was dead. The ship was silent again, as if nothing had happened at all. I spent the rest of the night pacing the corridors, too terrified to go back to my cabin. I kept hearing the whispers and the footsteps following me, but whenever I looked around, there was no one there. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I finally went back to my room, convinced I had imagined everything. I walked into the cabin and looked around, expecting the worst, but everything appeared normal. The lights were on. The temperature had returned to normal. I breathed a sigh of relief, but something was off. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the closet door, which was wide open. I cautiously approached it, my heart racing once more, but when I opened it, it was empty. No woman, no sign of what had happened the night before. I glanced around the cabin one last time, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of paper on the floor tucked under the edge of the bed. I picked it up, and my hands trembled as I read the words written in shaky handwriting. I was here. Don't leave me. I felt my stomach drop. I had never seen that note before. No one could have put it there. And yet, I had no memory of seeing it when I entered the cabin earlier. I stayed on the ship for the rest of the trip, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left as soon as we docked, eager to put the terrifying experience behind me. But the haunting memories still linger. I've heard similar stories since then, whispers of a woman who never left the ship, whose life was taken long ago. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear her voice. Help me.
Next story.
I was never one to believe in ghost stories. I thought they were just myths, exaggerated tales told to scare children. But that all changed during my trip to the Pacific Ocean. The ship was a beauty, one of the newest luxury cruise liners on the market. My friend Kate and I booked the trip as a celebration of our graduation. We were eager for adventure, eager for sun and relaxation, but we never imagined the darkness lurking beneath the surface of our voyage. The first few days went by without incident. We sailed through calm waters, enjoying the views, the food, and the company. It felt like a dream, waking up in a different port every day, eating under the stars, meeting other travelers from all over the world. But there was one thing that unsettled me from the start: the crew. They were all extremely polite, of course, and professional. But there was something about their eyes. Every now and then when we passed them in the halls, I noticed their stares lingered a little too long, and there was something cold about their expressions, like they knew something we didn't. I mentioned it to Kate once, and she just laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the third night of our voyage, the atmosphere changed. The ship seemed to be moving differently, shuddering every few minutes as if something beneath the water was pushing against it. The lights in our cabin flickered. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the windows, though there was no storm. Kate and I were in our room reading when we heard a soft knocking on the door. "Who is it?" I asked, though I knew it was odd for anyone to be at our door at this hour. No response. Just another 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. We both froze. "That's strange," Kate said, getting up to answer it. I reached for her arm before she could turn the knob. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's not right." But she shrugged me off. "It's probably just the crew. Maybe they need us to fill out some survey or something." With that, she opened the door. Nothing. Just the empty hallway outside. Kate hesitated before closing it again. I could see her trying to laugh it off, but I could tell she felt uneasy too. We didn't speak much after that. We just tried to distract ourselves, talking about everything but the eerie silence that filled the air. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises, scraping sounds coming from above and below, like something was dragging across the floor. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, though when I opened them, the room was still. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and went to the balcony to clear my mind. The ocean was pitch black, the only light coming from the stars above. The ship was silent, unnervingly so. Then I heard it, a soft, slow humming coming from deep within the bowels of the ship. I turned, thinking it was just the creaking of the ship, but I realized something. It wasn't a normal sound. It was the hum of an engine that wasn't supposed to be running. I stepped back into the cabin, my heart pounding. "Kate, wake up," I whispered, shaking her. But when I looked at her, I saw her lying still, her face pale and unmoving. At first, I thought she was just asleep. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Her chest wasn't rising and falling. She wasn't breathing. I screamed her name, shaking her harder now, but there was no response. Panic gripped me. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but as I glanced at the screen, I noticed something strange. No signal. The ship was supposed to have satellite reception, but the bars were all gone. I ran to the door, desperately banging on it, hoping someone would hear me. The knocking came again. 3 slow knocks, just like before. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see a crew member, but no one was there. Just the same empty hallway. My breath caught in my throat. The air felt colder now, and I realized that the humming had grown louder, more pronounced. It was coming from somewhere deep within the ship, somewhere I couldn't reach. I couldn't stay in the room any longer, not with Kate lying there, not with that presence lurking in the air. I left the cabin and ran down the hall, desperately searching for someone, anyone. But the ship was empty. I moved through the hallways, heart hammering in my chest, calling out for the crew, for anyone, but there was nothing. The ship was completely abandoned. As I turned a corner, I saw them. The crew members were standing at the end of the hallway, their faces pale, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared at me. I ran toward them, desperate for help, but as I got closer, something strange happened. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long. The crew members didn't get any closer. No matter how much I ran, they remained the same distance away. I could hear the humming growing louder now, almost deafening, as if the ship itself was alive. The walls around me began to pulse with the sound, and I realized too late that the ship wasn't a ship at all. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for someone like me to step aboard. I ran faster than I ever thought I could, my breath ragged in my chest, and when I turned the corner, I saw the elevator at the end of the hall. I pressed the button over and over, but nothing happened. The doors wouldn't open. It was as if the ship itself was locking me in, trapping me inside. Then I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around, and there she was. The woman. She stood behind me, dressed in tattered clothes that looked like they'd been soaked in the ocean. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow pits. Her lips were cracked, like they hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. Her voice was like gravel scraping against stone. "Now you belong to it." I didn't even have time to scream. The lights flickered once, and then everything went black. I woke up in my cabin. It was morning. The storm had passed. Kate was still in her bed, sleeping soundly. But something was off. The air felt heavy. The room felt wrong. I checked my phone. There was a message from my mother asking how the trip was going. It was sent just before midnight. I thought it was all a nightmare, some twisted hallucination brought on by stress. But then I checked the news. The cruise ship had gone missing. No distress signals, no signs of where it went. No one knew what had happened. I was the only one who returned. But I didn't come back alone. Every night the humming starts again, and the knocking and the whispering. Now you belong to it.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a vacation of a lifetime, just me and a group of friends celebrating the end of our college years on a week-long cruise to the Bahamas. No parents, no responsibilities, just sun, fun, and the open ocean. But what was meant to be the trip of a lifetime became a living nightmare that none of us would ever forget. I'll never forget the first day we boarded the ship. It was massive, like a floating city, and we all were buzzing with excitement. There were 10 of us in total, and we immediately set off to explore the ship, taking in the extravagant pools, the endless buffet lines, and the bright, cheerful staff that greeted us at every turn. Everything about the ship screamed luxury and relaxation. We felt invincible, ready to enjoy everything it had to offer. But that first night, as we gathered at the bar to kick off our trip with a few drinks, things started to feel a little off. The air grew thick with tension as we chatted, and a few of the others started to mention feeling uneasy. A couple of them even swore they saw shadowy figures in the corners of the room, but I laughed it off as a trick of the light, or maybe just too many drinks. We were all having fun, and I didn't want to let anything ruin the mood. That night, when I went to bed in my cabin, I had the strangest feeling. It wasn't a nightmare, but more of an unsettling awareness that I wasn't alone. The room felt colder than usual, even though the air conditioning was set high, and there was a faint smell of something rotting. But when I checked around, the room seemed fine. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. I didn't sleep well. The next day, we docked at the first island and spent the entire day off the ship, enjoying the sunshine, the beach, and the excitement of the new location. But as soon as we boarded the ship again, I started feeling it again, like I was being followed. It was a strange, creeping sensation that started at the base of my neck and spread through my entire body. That night, after a long day of activities, we all gathered in one of the ship's common areas to play cards and hang out. The area was dimly lit, almost as if the lights were intentionally lowered to create a more intimate atmosphere. But as we played, something odd happened. One of our friends, Mark, who had been quiet the entire evening, suddenly stood up and started walking toward the back of the room. We all looked at him, confused, but didn't say anything. We thought maybe he was just a little tipsy and needed to stretch his legs, but then he stopped. Mark was standing in front of a door that led into the back of the ship, a maintenance area that was off limits to passengers. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, and then he turned toward us with a strange look in his eyes. His face was pale and his mouth opened as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. The entire room fell silent. Even though we were all sitting right there, we couldn't hear the usual hum of the ship. It was as if everything around us had gone still. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice low and unrecognizable. "They're waiting for us." We all laughed, assuming he was joking or just being weird. But then Mark walked toward the door again, moving like a puppet on strings, and he tried to open it. One of us rushed over to stop him, but before we could, the door swung open on its own. The room on the other side was dark, but there was a chill that seeped out from it, a kind of cold that felt wrong, like it didn't belong on the ship. We tried to pull Mark back, but he resisted, and as we struggled to get him away from the door, we heard something, a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, so distinct that it froze us in place. The voice was barely audible, but it repeated the same words over and over again. "Come closer." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he simply stepped forward into the dark room as if he were sleepwalking. We rushed after him, but before we could get a grip on him, the door slammed shut behind him, cutting us off from him completely. It took us several minutes to get the door open, and when we finally did, Mark was standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide with terror. He was muttering under his breath, repeating the same phrase over and over, "They're here. They're waiting." He wasn't himself. His skin had turned pale, his body trembling. We tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond. Something was terribly wrong. We managed to get him back to his cabin where he passed out. We assumed it was some kind of stress or exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. The whispers, the cold, the strange behavior, it all felt wrong, like the ship itself was alive in some twisted way. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I stayed up, trying to read, but the air around me felt thick. My phone kept buzzing, and when I checked it, I saw that several of our group had sent messages saying they couldn't sleep either. Everyone had been feeling uneasy, but no one had dared to speak about it out loud. I went to the hallway to get some air, but as I passed by a closed door, I heard something faint, a voice, a soft, low whisper. "Help us." I stopped, my heart racing. The door was slightly cracked open, and the voice seemed to be coming from the room inside. But when I looked through the crack, all I saw was darkness. I pushed the door open, my heart pounding. Inside, there was nothing. No one. But the whispering grew louder, echoing all around me. "Help us. Join us." Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I whipped around, but no one was there. I was alone. I rushed back to my cabin, locking the door behind me. I couldn't take it anymore. The ship was alive. Something was wrong, and it was trying to pull us in. We didn't belong here. Something was waiting, and it wasn't going to let us leave. The next morning, we all packed our things and disembarked at the nearest port. We didn't care about missing out on the rest of the trip. We just wanted to leave. As we stepped off the ship, we looked back and saw the same figure standing by the railing, staring at us with those empty eyes. We never spoke about what happened after we left. The memories of that night still haunt me, and I wonder if the ship is still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to board, to hear the whispers, and to be pulled into the darkness.
Next story.
We were a group of college friends who decided to take a spring break cruise to the Caribbean, something to celebrate the end of our semester and before we all went our separate ways after graduation. The kind of vacation that was meant to be carefree. No worries, no deadlines, just good times, sun, and sea. But when we boarded the ship, something felt off from the beginning. I couldn't explain it, but I noticed it immediately. The ship seemed too quiet. The crew members were friendly enough, but their smiles didn't seem to reach their eyes. And there was a strange atmosphere in the air that no one could really describe. On the first night, we were all gathered in the ship's lounge, having drinks and laughing. It was a typical scene, loud music, people dancing, and the kind of carefree energy that comes with being on vacation. But there was something odd about the way the lights flickered every so often. It wasn't like a normal flicker, like when a bulb is about to go out. It felt more deliberate, like something was trying to communicate. When the lights flickered again, I looked around and noticed that there was a man standing near the edge of the room. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, with an old-fashioned style that didn't seem to fit with the modern vibe of the ship. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were too dark, too empty. It was like looking into a void. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't moving. He just stood there, staring into the crowd. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired or the lights were messing with my head. I turned back to my friends, trying to push the strange sensation away. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching me. Every time I glanced around, he was still there, standing in the same spot, doing nothing but staring. I don't know how long it was before I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, excusing myself from the group, and made my way out of the lounge. I needed to get some fresh air, clear my head. The ship was large, but the open decks were still quiet this time of night. I was leaning over the railing, staring at the dark waters below, trying to calm myself, when I felt a presence behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I could feel it. His cold stare like a weight pressing down on me. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" a voice said. A deep, gravelly voice that sounded too old to belong to someone my age. I spun around, my heart racing. There he was, the man from the lounge, standing just a few feet away from me, his pale face now illuminated by the faint moonlight. "You," I stammered, unsure of what to say. "Enjoying your cruise?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, but it was piercing, like it was inside my head. The sea holds many secrets. Some are better left unknown. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. It was like I was frozen, rooted to the spot. He didn't move. He just stood there, looking at me with those hollow, soulless eyes. The silence stretched on, and I felt the weight of his presence growing heavier. Then, as if he were never there to begin with, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows. I blinked, and when I looked around, he was gone. Just like that. I rushed back to the lounge, where I found my friends still enjoying themselves, but when I tried to tell them what happened, they just brushed it off, laughing as if it was some kind of joke. "You've had too much to drink, man," one of them said, slapping me on the back. But I could tell from the nervous glances they exchanged that they weren't entirely convinced. The next day, things started to get even weirder. I woke up with a headache and decided to skip breakfast, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over me. It was as though something was wrong with the ship, something I couldn't put my finger on. The crew members acted strangely, always a little too quiet, a little too stiff. And when I tried to ask about the man I had seen the night before, no one seemed to know what I was talking about. It was as if he didn't exist. But that night, when I was alone in my cabin, it happened again. I was lying in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard a soft knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated, then got up to open it. When I opened the door, no one was there. But there, on the floor, was an old photograph, the edges curled and yellowed with age. I picked it up, my heart sinking when I looked at it. It was a picture of the ship, a black and white photo from decades ago. The ship looked exactly the same as it did now, except for one thing. Standing on the deck in the same suit was the man. I could feel my blood run cold. How could this be possible? How was he in the photo taken decades ago when I had just seen him the night before? As I stared at the photograph, I realized something even more disturbing. The man was standing in the same spot, the same place where I had seen him the night before. It was like he had always been there, and maybe he always would be. The knocking came again, louder this time, and it felt like it was coming from inside the walls, as though the ship itself was trying to communicate. I ran to the door, but when I opened it, there was nothing, no one. Just the empty corridor stretching out before me, the dim light flickering overhead. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the photograph in my hands, unable to sleep. The rest of the cruise went by in a blur, but the strange feeling never left me. Every time I looked out at the ocean, I felt like I was being watched. The crew members gave me strange looks, and whenever I asked about the man or the photograph, they just brushed me off. When the ship finally docked, I couldn't wait to leave. As I walked down the gangway, I glanced back one last time at the ship. It was now docked, still and silent. But as I stood there, I swear I saw him again. Standing by the railing, watching me, the man in the dark suit. His eyes never left me as I stepped off the ship and onto solid ground. And I knew deep down that the ship was not just haunted by him, but by something much darker, something older than any of us could comprehend. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the soft, eerie knock on the door, the whispering voice, the feeling that something is waiting for me, just beyond the edge of the sea.
Next story.
I was always the adventurous type. I loved traveling, exploring new places, and diving into unfamiliar cultures. So when I booked a solo cruise to Alaska, I thought it would be the perfect way to get away from the noise of everyday life and have some time for reflection. The ship was massive, and the voyage was promised to be an unforgettable journey through the icy waters, with breathtaking views of glaciers and wildlife. But what I didn't know was that this trip would become something I'd never be able to forget, not for the reasons I thought. The first few days were incredible. I marveled at the scenery, watched the sunset over the ocean, and even joined a couple of excursions in various ports. I met other passengers, had some great conversations, and took pictures of the magnificent landscapes. The weather was colder than I had expected, but the air felt refreshing and the ship was comfortable. I thought this might be one of the best vacations I'd ever had. But then, on the fourth night of the voyage, something happened. It started with an unsettling feeling. I had just returned to my cabin after dinner. The ship was rocking slightly in the rough waters, and I noticed that the hallway outside was unusually quiet. The other passengers were probably either asleep or at one of the bars. As I walked toward my door, I glanced down the hallway and saw a figure at the far end. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark suit and standing completely still. His back was to me, but I couldn't see his face. He was positioned just outside a door, and from where I stood, I could see that his hand was resting against the doorframe, as though he were waiting for someone. There was something about him that unsettled me. The way he stood there motionless, as if he were part of the ship itself. I quickened my pace and went inside my room, locking the door behind me. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, scratching, tapping, like something was moving in the walls. I tried to shake it off, but there was a gnawing unease in the pit of my stomach. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang, followed by a soft knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, listening. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't get up. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to look through the peephole. Whoever it was, I didn't want to know. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued for what felt like an eternity, each knock growing louder and faster until it was almost a pounding. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, grabbed my phone, and called the front desk. But the line was dead. I looked at my phone screen. It was completely blank. The connection had been severed. My heart was racing. What was going on? Why was there no one at the desk? Why had my phone gone out? I crept over to the door, cautiously peeking through the peephole. I saw nothing at first, just the empty hallway. But then I saw something moving at the far end, a shadow, moving unnaturally fast, almost gliding across the floor. I yanked my head away from the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear something else now, a low, guttural whisper. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. "Help me." It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. My hands shook as I grabbed the door handle. The hallway was empty when I opened it. There was no one there, but I felt a presence, something cold like ice against my skin. I took a step into the hallway, and that's when I saw it. The man was standing there again. This time he was facing me. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty, like black holes sucking in all the light around him. His mouth was slightly open, as though he were about to speak, but no words came out. I froze. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. Then he started to move toward me. Slowly at first, but his pace picked up, like he was gliding across the floor, inching closer with every second. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, like it had been filled with sand. He was closer now, just a few feet away. I turned and ran down the hallway, not looking back, not caring where I was going. All I wanted was to get away from him. The hallway seemed endless, like it was stretching on, no matter how fast I ran. The ship's lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I turned a corner and finally found the stairs to the lower deck. I took them two at a time, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. I didn't stop running until I reached the bottom of the stairs where the crew members were gathered near a door. They all turned to look at me as I stumbled into the room, breathless and terrified. But when I looked at them, I realized something horrifying. Their eyes were just like his, empty, black, lifeless. "Are you all right?" one of them asked, but his voice sounded hollow, as though it was coming from a distant place. I saw him," I said, my voice shaking. "The man, the one who was following me." The crew members exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. One of them finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "You shouldn't have seen him." And that's when it hit me. The man, the one who was following me, wasn't alive. He was one of the ship's ghosts, part of a terrible secret that no one had warned me about. The ship was haunted, but no one spoke of it. The crew knew. They'd known for years, but they never let anyone leave once they'd seen it. I looked at the crew again, and the fear set in. They were no longer just crew members, they were part of the ship's curse. I turned and bolted for the exit, desperate to escape. The ship was vast, but the longer I stayed, the closer I felt the presence of those shadows, those cold eyes, watching me from every corner. I barely made it off the ship at the next port, escaping the haunted nightmare that had become my vacation. I don't know what happens to the people who disappear on those ships, but I do know this. There's something about the water, something about the cold depths beneath the ship that calls out to those who are curious enough to see it. And once you do, it's you belong to the ship. I never went back on another cruise again.